now. Hello, welcome to the Space Race webinar in the National Association of Scholars American History series. We've gone from 1620 nearly to the present, and we've gotten to the space race. Now, I am delighted to have as our three guests, two of whom are present and one of whom I trust will be showing up extremely quickly, in alphabetical order. Mr. Leonard David is a veteran space journalist who has reported on space for over 50 years. He is the author of numerous books, and I'm not going to mention them all because they should be appearing in the chat bottom below soonest. But the Moon Rush, The New Space Race, Mars, Our Future on the Red Planet, co-author with Buzz Aldrin, former director of research for the National Commission on Space. Dr. Andrew Jenks is professor of history at California State University, Long Beach, where he specializes in the history of modern Europe, Russia, and science. Among his many publications are The Cosmonaut Who Couldn't Stop Smiling, The Life and Legend of Yuri Gagarin, Collaboration in Space, and The Search for Peace on Earth. And finally, our third participant, who is not yet here, but I trust will be here before his time to speak comes up. Dr. Robert Poole is professor of history at the University of Central Lancashire, where his work includes the cultural history of the space age. He is the author of several books, including Earthrise, How Man First Saw the Earth. And he will, I trust, be here soonest. Now, the chat, the first link, you can find the speaker's books here, and we've got a link. Now, format. Each of our speakers speaks for perhaps 12 to 14 minutes. We then follow this up with questions from you, the audience, and sometimes from yours truly. The questions from you, the audience, go into the chat or Q&A buttons below. I will relay them, or the participants can look it down and answer as they will, or they will just talk to each other as they like, just for interesting conversation. When I bring questions to our participants, it's going to be any order I like, just to make what I think is a fun order for a conversation. Do not worry if your question does not get answered. Send email to me, randall@nas.org, when this is finished. I'll be delighted to forward your questions to our participants so that they can have the option of answering you. Also, don't worry if you have to leave soon. This is being recorded for posterity on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel, not the NAS, because that belongs to a rapper named Nas, or Sobriquet. He has more people following him than are following us. Darn it! But we're working on it. We're catching up with him. We'll exceed him by 2023. On that note, Mr. David, would you be so kind as to begin?
Okay, thanks for having me. I have to warn you, when you're a space journalist, you're so busy quoting other people. Sometimes you have time to think to yourself that you have some opinions about where we're headed and our past. And luckily, Chance, if you want to throw the first slide on, I'll speak to that so I can keep my wits about me. The theme of this is really, when I first saw it, it was a good bracketing of the past. And, we start out with Russia's Sputnik 1. If you want to do the next slide there, with the 184-pound satellite that the beep heard around the world. And as a kid in Waco, Texas, I saw at least the carrier rocket that put up Sputnik, and it was pretty impressive. As a fellow traveler, which is what the Sputnik stood for, it was amazing to see something artificial that was launched by a country, and the prowess that took to put that satellite up. And again, the bookend of 1975 ending in détente in space with Russia and the United States doing the Apollo-Soyuz program. So next slide. And clearly the unbelievable effort by the former Soviet Union to put up the first human in space, Yuri Gagarin, and in April of '61, and you know, I always look at these pictures, and when you think about spacecraft that took humanity into space for the first time, I do remember something. I think it was attributed to John Glenn. Is like, you know, in those one-seater capsules, you didn't ride in them, you wore them. And same with the Russians. So next slide. I'm just setting this up in the sense of in the time period that we are discussing here, and a little bit into the future. You know, the United States, you know, pioneered a single capsule, the Gemini program with 2 people, and Apollo with 3. And here we are in next day or so, they're rolling out the Orion capsule on top of the Space Launch System. This is all NASA for the Artemis program. So in a lot of ways, I keep thinking, boy, it's a good time to be a kid right now, about when I first got involved in space writing. And today it's almost like our own space startup. You know, we're back to some very basic things of proving hardware and technology, and you know how far we've advanced with different kinds of equipment and hardware that we can reassemble and reboot the moon, at least for the United States, and we'll see in other countries are coming behind us. Okay, the next slide. You know, people do tend to forget that at one point there was a Kennedy Khrushchev, former president of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev, with our president here in the United States, which they were discussing whether or not there could be a joint moon landing program. And in the end, it was niet from Khrushchev, but you know, we went on to land the first astronauts, humans, on the moon in 1969, Apollo 11. But let me get to a little bit of the next slide. And that is, you know, trying to think about this now, today, after, you know, luckily I've been involved with, you know, watching the global space program evolve. And next slide. I think the big ticket item in space for the 21st century is watching China. They are moving out fast. They have a multifaceted space program. They are working on their space station that should be done by the year's end. They've got 3 taikonauts, or astronauts, up in that structure right now, and they're going to be launching in quick succession several new lab modules, 2 more piloted Shenzhou spacecraft to dock with this facility and help put it together. It's a piece by piece effort, and it's pretty amazing watching China on a, again, multifaceted space agenda, including interplanetary flight to Mars with a robotic spacecraft that they successfully landed there on their first attempt. And they're going to be doing perhaps a Mars sample return in the 2030 timeframe. Again, all robotic, but it's pretty impressive to me what that foretells about the future. Next slide. The last thing is sort of, you know, in my reporting, what has been amazing to me is, again, the rise of the commercial space agenda. We have more private companies. This morning, I watched the Astra Group launch a rocket with satellites on top of it from Kodiak, Alaska, a young entrepreneurial group. Surely everybody is aware of Elon Musk and the SpaceX activity. We've got, in next week, we're going to see Jeff Bezos launches New Shepard suborbital rocket with 6 passengers on board, one of which I know very well. So this is getting really real for me from a personal basis of actually having friends of mine go up for these suborbital flights. Certainly, again, the role of other nations in shaping the space future for the 21st century, including India, a multitude, the UAE. You're having really a renaissance of capability of reconfiguring what we see as the space programs of the future. In the US, I'm somewhat cynical, to be honest. I have a problem with NASA constancy of purpose, which sounds very nice. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to have seen constipation of purpose. When you have multiple administrations give and take what the NASA program should be, whether the budgets are correct, and again, trying to push an agenda that stays put. And I do worry about the future. I do think we're probably, with the amount of humans going up, I think we all have to always be prepared for accidents. So the loss of human life, it could be in China, it could be another country, it could be in the US. So I think that too will shape the space agenda as we move along down the road. And of course, then you have the unknown unknowns. It's always great to think about what could be, what discoveries are awaiting us out there. And there's so many. And I think obviously one of the bigger ones is, it's a cliche when you're tired at night writing stories, you always go, are we alone in the universe? Well, I think it's corny now. We're not alone. Now we're arguing about just how crowded is it. With the success of the James Webb Space Telescope and advances in ground-based astronomy, we're clearly headed for a population density that we didn't realize was out there. So I think that's pretty much a framework of my thoughts at the moment, and keeping in my little niche of time here. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to ask that we then go to our next speaker, Professor Jenks.
Thank you so much for having me. This is great. And what I want to, I guess, talk about are a couple of things. First of all, I really appreciated this idea of bookends that Leonard was talking about, that if we think about the history of space exploration, we indeed can't think about it in sports terms as a kind of race, I suppose, from the end of World War II, and particularly with Sputnik, all the way on up through the Apollo-Soyuz test project. And then from Apollo-Soyuz test project leading up to the International Space Station, the race, the competition doesn't go away, as we see with China in particular. But there is an emphasis on collaboration that starts with Apollo-Soyuz, it goes through the intercosmos Soviet collaborative programs and on up through the International Space Station. And that's very much challenged by the current situation in Ukraine, as perhaps we've all heard. What I think I would like to do is I've written books about that. My most recent book about the era of collaboration, 1975 onward. And my earlier research, my biography of Yuri Gagarin, was set fundamentally in this earlier period of a space race. So what I thought I would do, given the war in Ukraine, is try to connect the space race to what's going on right now in Ukraine. And let me see if I can do that successfully. Hopefully this will be a little bit enlightening. with some images of Yuri Gagarin and how he is connected to what's going on. And so I'm going to try to see if I can do this. Let me know if this works or not. You should be seeing a slide with a bust of Yuri Gagarin. Is that the case?
Yep.
Got it.
Good. Excellent. All right. So what is this image? One of many, many thousands of busts of Yuri Gagarin that not only in Russia, but in Ukraine as well, in many other places. So this was sent to me by a friend who captured this, I believe it was in 2008. And it's a bust of Yuri Gagarin that has graffiti on it. Sorry, this was 2012 for the anniversary of his first flight, his flight April 12th, 1961. And so it says Y.A. Gagarin in Russian on the pedestal. And then it has graffiti on it that says, Yuri, we effed it all up. And what's meant by this, there are various ways you can interpret this, I suppose, is that we did not live up to the promise of continuing the glory that was the era of the space race, of Sputnik, of Alexei Leonov, the first man to walk in space, of course, of Yuri Gagarin, Laika, the first dog in space, Tereshkova, the first woman in space. You know, we had all these first and all these glorious accomplishments. The Soviet Union collapsed and we effed it all up. We did not live up to your promise. Okay, so what has Putin done? Putin has traded in two aspects of Soviet history to try to use them in order to reaffirm Russia's identity for Russians, but also on the international stage, and with mixed success, as we can see with the bungled war effort in Ukraine. One of them is the glory of World War II, the great patriotic war as Russians know it. That memory is constantly projected into people's brains through the propaganda, through the Russian film industry, building on top of the Soviet cult of the Great Patriotic War. And the second is the glory of the Soviet space program, and in particular, the cult of Yuri Gagarin, which has been enthusiastically embraced by Putin. And Putin's goal, you might say, is to correct what the vandalists said here, that Yuri, we screwed it all up. We effed it all up. So Putin wants to fix that. Okay, so how has he fixed it? This is an image from the hometown of Gagarin, which is on the border of Belarus. Place called Gzhatsk, it actually is also named after Gagarin. This has an image of Gagarin, and this is in 2015, right after Crimea has been taken over. And what does it say here? Of course, you've got the iconic smiling image of Yuri Gagarin, and it says here in Russian, Yura my ispravilis, which means Yuri, Yura is the diminutive, we did it. We did it, right? So we didn't F it up. We actually corrected that mistake and we did it. And what do we see here? We see a map that has Crimea. So what is it that they did? They took Crimea in order to fulfill the glory and promise of Gagarin's great feat, not April 12th, 1961, at least as interpreted in the Putin era. And then here you see caring Russian soldiers giving humanitarian aid to refugees, probably from Syria, where they were butchering people. We see the recovery of the Russian oil industry. All these are images that suggest that we corrected the failed promise, the failure when the Soviet Union collapsed and we became a second-rate power. And I would argue this is the connection between Yuri Gagarin and the space race and what we're seeing today in Ukraine, is that there is a direct link, at least in the Russian mind, between the glory of the space race and Russian empire, Soviet Russian empire. And of course, this is directly hinted at here with the image of Crimea. Russians said after Crimea had been annexed in 2014, Zato Krym nash, which in Russian means, well, despite everything, at least we have Crimea. So that would justify everything. Here's just a closer image of that, a closer picture. Here you can see the revival, supposedly, of the Russian aerospace industry, which is also one of the other things that they wanted to revive in order to make Russia glorious and strong once again. I'm going to go to just to show you a couple more images that reflect this theme that I'm trying to develop here. And it has to do with the central pavilion for the celebration of the people's achievements, which was a kind of Disneyland in the outskirts of Moscow that celebrated all the industrial and cultural and economic achievements of the Soviet Union. This is a picture from 2007. And so the Central Space Pavilion had been turned into a flea market for gardening implements. And if you look at this banner that's in front of this white circular thing here on the wall, that white circular thing on the wall contained the portrait of Gagarin in his helmet. And so here you can see how this sacred Soviet space celebrating accomplishments in the beginning of the 2000s had been treated so carelessly. Right after I took this picture, I was doing my research for my biography of Yuri Gagarin. I received news that this flea market was shut down under orders by Putin, and that it should be revived to its previous glorious state. And here it is today. Back to the glorious times of the space race, celebrating all those great Soviet accomplishments. Yura, we did it. We didn't F it up, we did it. And again, maybe I'm pressing this a little bit too far, but doing it also is associated with reestablishing empire. So in other words, in the Soviet mind, there is a connection between Soviet space accomplishment and territorial aggrandizement on Earth. A connection, in other words, between space and politics back on Earth, which I think reminds us also that this period of the space race was as much political as it was technological and scientific, that it had as much to do with identity issues as it had to do with advancing our knowledge of the cosmos. Of course, it could do both of those things simultaneously. And that's a reminder also, I think, of the challenge of space exploration now. What political purpose does space exploration serve? Back in the day, right, of the Cold War, it served the purpose of allowing both sides to display their superiority. And today, I don't think it has, in this age of commercialism, that same kind of political importance, right? It does for the Russians, of course, but the Russians don't have the technical and scientific capabilities anymore to be able to realize its political goals through space exploration. I think that's clear for, I don't know if Leonard would agree with me on that, but I think that the Russian space program is not what it used to be, just like its military. Maybe China, as Leonard suggested, will be the challenge, the political challenge to the United States that will get us back in the game in a more enthusiastic way that will also unite people politically behind space exploration. But so long as it's simply, I think, a commercial enterprise, I don't see that there's going to be a lot of little kids wanting to go into space. Like all those kids that watched all the things going on in the space race in the 1960s, even the 1970s, wanting to be an astronaut or a cosmonaut, let's say in Russia. I just don't see that. They want to be YouTubers, right? They want to have this sort of fame that comes from being on TikTok and Twitter. And their gaze is not directed toward the cosmos, but rather into virtual space and the little screens on their phones. Any rate, I'll just stop right there.
Thank you so much. And I am going to say that we don't seem to have our third panelist. I suspect we had a time zone issue here. I am going to go first to a question from Matt Mulken in the Q&A. And by the way, I do encourage everyone, questions, chat and Q&A. What do you think should be the points of a lot more humans in space? More time in low Earth orbit? Maybe for a few more very wealthy tourists that will chill the first time one gets killed. Do we want instead more extended duration in a space station? It's unclear why more humans are needed up there. Do we want to go back to the moon? We've been there. We can hardly stay there past one lunar day. Should we land on Mars? It seems impossible this century, except as a one-way trip. Oh, clearly we need a prison colony on Mars. That's how we're going to settle it. So responses on both of your parts to Professor Mulken's questions.
You want to take that, Andrew? Kick it off.
Yeah, okay. I'll give that a whirl. Yeah, I think that also comes down to a matter of political support. And God, with the COVID, with the changing security structures and national emergencies in Ukraine and elsewhere throughout Europe, even if there was, if you could come up with a good answer for why we should go to all those places in response to the question, I'm just not sure the political will or the money is there. And I don't know that that commercial enterprises, the Bezos and Musk of the world, are going to be able to sustain this. But, I think it's, back in, when we went to the moon, and, I've been in the Nixon archives and looking at the letters that people wrote in response to the landing on the moon, and there were a good number of them. Many were very enthusiastic, that said, why are we wasting our money doing this, right? And I think that even more so today, the political support for colonizing different places in the cosmos is just not there. And that's, even if it was a good idea, and I'm not sure that it is, that makes it, I think, something that can't be realized. I don't want to be so pessimistic, but it's hard not to be these days.
I guess my response is something I use in sometimes when I get a little depressed about it all. If pessimism was a rocket fuel, we'd be out of the solar system by now. My guess is there's going to be some technological surprises coming from all kinds of new avenues, and space is so big, but it's going to shrink. It's already shrinking. We're out to Pluto with we flew robotically past Pluto. I mean, our ability and other nations' ability now to do space exploration in its really raw form. There's so much open for discovery. I don't have any doubt that, again, I think people, the commercial, I'll take task with that a little bit. I think the commercial side, and I'm a little skeptical on some of these groups, but certainly Elon Musk and Bezos have a passion for space. And when you go and listen to some of the folks that are engaged in the SpaceX space dream ship that he's putting together, they're ready to go. Give me a helmet, I'm gonna go. And so I think the passion is there. It's certainly going to be a lot of countdowns to disaster. There are going to be things blowing up right and left. But that's when I came into it. I grew up in San Diego, and everybody around me was building the Atlas rocket. And I could hear the Atlas engines in Sycamore Canyon blasting away and failing and blowing up, and things were bad. And, the Mercury 7 astronauts didn't have a ride to space, So, and so I think we're sort of in a kind of a rejuvenation of worry and concern, and awaiting new pioneering efforts. So I wouldn't be writing about space this long, and if I thought it was all a dead end. I hope I'm right.
If I just might, I mean, I don't want to get too sort of into the weeds of historical analysis with all this, but another way that I might answer that question is that, when I think about exploration of space, there are kind of two competing currents. And one is sort of projecting national prerogatives and national security objectives into the exploration and colonization of space. So that space is a place that you basically extended national power into. and the space race was a reflection of that. But there was a counter tendency that was built into the founding legislation for NASA, was that space should be a collaborative effort. And that space was a way where you could transcend business as usual back on Earth. In other words, there was a utopian sort of association of space exploration with transforming Earth into a better place where people would cooperate rather than wage war against each other. And, you know, those two tendencies were always there. It's kind of like a pendulum swing. At a certain point, the more sort of national prerogatives and security issues predominated in space exploration. At other points, the collaborative efforts rose to the forefront, as with the Apollo-Soyuz test project or the International Space Station as examples of that. And I guess it's that the romantic sort of idea of sort of astrofuturism and building new kinds of communities in space, maybe it is up to now not states to do this, but the enthusiasm of people like Musk and Bezos and many others. And it'll be curious to see if they can sustain the more utopian sort of ideas associated with space exploration, because I don't think states really care about that utopian stuff at all anymore, if they did so much at all anyhow.
Yeah, one thing that strikes me, and you're thinking there, you know, a lot of this was, although, you know, we strive for cooperation and collaboration, they sound great, but, you know, each one of these events really signals an economic structure that allowed this activity to happen. I mean, you know, the paranoia from Sputnik drove us to have, can we have an American space program run on democratic principles, whereas the Soviet Union is communism is in orbit. And, you know, when I first saw the artificial whatever it was, you know, most people are going, is there a bomb in there? You know, do they have, and, you know, the boosters were very big for the Soviets early on. And again, atlases were blowing up, and, you know, vanguards were falling on the launch pad in our first attempt to put a satellite in orbit. So, you know, and it really, you know, that the space race, which I think we're in today, I get people criticizing me saying there's a space race. Haven't you noticed? And there is. I'm convinced that we're in a big new race for economic, shouldering our competitive nature and showing it to the world, whoever is doing it. So we're in deep on this, and the next, you know, we've got so much capability locked up in robotic. I think the question triggered in my mind, it's always the human versus robotic activity. And that's always a great question. You know, why put humans in harm's way? But I think it was astronaut Stafford says they don't give parades to robots in New York. So, you know, there you go.
Well, this is in my book on Gagarin. This is one of the arguments that, you know, that I make, that why Gagarin? Why did they transform him into such a kind of cult figure? And well, one reason was because they couldn't talk about the engineers. They were a secret, right? Their identities. So they had no one else to talk about except the cosmonauts. They became the sort of the public face of the secret Soviet space program. But another reason they talked about the cosmonauts is the same reason we talked about the astronauts. It's illustrated by your Stafford story or anecdote, right? That we like to humanize things, right? We like to tell stories about human beings, and it's hard to tell compelling stories about machines. And so I think that's another reason that we actually that people are going to have to go into space continually in order to generate enthusiasm and interest, because there's just something compelling about that, much more so than sending probes to other planets.
Right. I one little thing that maybe you can comment on that worries me about, you know, the Russians are about ready to launch back into moon exploration with the Lunar 25. They haven't been back to the moon since '67 And Lavochkin group in Russia is the hardware developer. And I'm always wondering whether or not they've lost all the talent they had. I mean, you can go back and revere Venus landings and return sample from the moon robotically. The Russians were doing some fantastic, former Soviet Union, fantastic firsts. You mentioned firsts. And you do wonder whether or not the technical wherewithal, the engineering professionalism that mentored younger people that are maybe no longer there. I don't know who's running the show over there. And so they may have, their own failures coming up that will question, their abilities maybe in the public mind about Russia re-entering in an aggressive manner space exploration. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't see that happening. To use your word show, it's an SH show over there in Russia right now. And what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed is that they lost all sorts of intellectual assets across many of their industries, right? And Putin has presided over what's called a kleptocracy. A court of, these oligarchs have feasted upon the carcass of the old Soviet Union and its industrial infrastructure, transforming themselves into billionaires. And Putin has tried to reestablish Russian power through nuclear power, through its space program, through investments in the military. But all that money that gets spent, the billions of rubles that get spent, just goes directly into the kleptocracy and lining the pockets. And it doesn't actually produce new technology that is useful. We're seeing that right now with the Russian military, which is a disaster. Where did all that money go? What went into the yachts that these oligarchs can't, sail in for a time, right? And that the same thing is true of the Soviet space program. I mean, the Russian space program, is that most of that money, those investments have gone into this black hole of the kleptocracy, rather into attracting talent and producing new technologies and first. And it's sad. It's sad to watch. And if you talk to, insiders, well, you can't talk to them now about these things because of the situation, they will tell you how depressed they are, that the momentum really has shifted to China in so many different ways. They're, as you pointed out, Leonard, they're doing so many amazing things, really under the radar in many respects.
Yeah.
So I have a question of my own, which I want to do, pushing back actually on the idea of the Soviet view of the space program being, largely official. I was thinking immediately of, Andrei Tarkovsky and Solaris, Polish source, but nevertheless, and in fact, a Russian science fiction, scene as well. So I guess I would want to sort of broaden that. How much is there an official view of space? How successful is it? How much is it fought back? And I want to, actually, Russia, but also, modern science has its own science fiction. And after all, American views of space and space exploration were hardly monopolized by their government. What's the interplay between the official and the unofficial?
Is that, Leonard, do you want to take that on? I don't.
Why don't you do that one?
Okay, you can both, but Professor Jenks, why don't you first, and then Mr. David, if you wanted to follow up.
It's a great question. I love that question. Yeah, this is, that some of the more interesting scholarship has noted about this history of the Soviet space program, that it was not simply a top-down phenomenon. There was genuine bottom-up grassroots sort of enthusiasm for space exploration that actually predates the Russian Revolution. Tradition of cosmism and the father of Soviet rocketry, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, and efforts in the 1920s and 30s to work on rocketry that produced Sergei Korolev, who was put into the Gulag for a time, by the way, by Stalin. These are people that worked despite the absence of top-down support. And it was only when they captured, of course, the V2 rocket technology and realized the strategic importance of space exploration for nuclear warfare and ICBMs, that the Stalinist state began to support this in a big way. But that enthusiasm always existed. It existed in the form of science fiction. It existed in the form of societies that met independently of government support. And it continues actually to this day, this idea of cosmism, that it is Russia's fate to explore the cosmos, and that the cosmos actually is the cradle of human civilization, and that in exploring it, we're going back to the cradle, the place where humanity came from, and that we are destined to have to colonize other places. That this is very much a part of Russian culture. It's a strong element that has not gone away. And what has gone away, of course, is a competent state.
I guess I'm not sure I can add too much to that. That's good. The only thing I can think of is today and tomorrow, the European Space Agency is meeting in the council that they have of like 22 nations to discuss partly what are they going to do with Russia and their space agenda, because Russia and the European Space Agency have agreements in place, and they look like they're going to cancel the ExoMars robot that was supposed to launch later this year. And I don't know if they're going to go that direction or not, but that's a huge program. It's been decades in the making, and it has a Russian lander system to put the European rover on the red planet. And then you have ESA working with Russia on their Lunar program. They've got a couple of Lunar landers that are going to the South Pole to do an early assessment of whether or not water is there to perhaps build a international lunar research station with China. And so it's really a mess right now. And I just don't know how you've got the head of Roscosmos, the Twitter nut, and he's shooting off Twitters right and left, really, kind of upsetting the whole global space community in the process. So I don't know where this is going to go. I just don't know. Break glass and roll dice here. It's one of those deals.
And one can only imagine the horror felt by all the Russian engineers, by all the Russian scientists who are participants in all the programs that you mentioned, whose lives have changed. They had gotten used to, even going back to the Soviet period, broad collaboration with their French colleagues, with the ESA, with the United States and NASA. Now all of this, and with, as you pointed out, also with China, and now all of this is gone in the last 3 weeks. Their life has completely changed. And I think you're right, Leonard. It's hard to say what impact it will have, but it's going to have a dramatic impact on the global space exploration project. It won't stall it, but all the programs that depend on that collaboration that are now going to be canceled for political reasons or just for practical reasons are left hanging. And think of all the thousands of engineers and scientists who have devoted their lives to these projects, and now they will come to nothing. It's very sad.
Yeah.
I am going to go with another question from the audience, from John Shesky. Approximately when, why, and who in the Soviet Union made the decision not to continue to try to go to the moon? And I'm just going to broaden that so Mr. David can have a look in. When did America realize that the Soviets were not actually going to go to the moon? But I guess Professor Jenks first.
Yeah, well, the Soviets had the advantage of secrecy, whereas NASA, of course there were classified projects, right? And Pentagon projects, plenty of that going on. But the NASA launches and the Apollo missions were all very much played out in public. And the Soviet Union had the advantage of not having to present the behind the scenes stuff in preparation for its moon hope for moon landings as in public. And so they just lied, and they said they never did it. They weren't interested in that. When it turned out the United States got there first, and they shifted. But of course, they had a fairly substantial effort devoted to trying to beat the U.S. to the moon, putting a man on the moon, and they failed. They failed. And so I think that it was with the successful U.S. Landing on the moon that their manned program to get onto the moon was terminated, and they shifted to low Earth orbit and space stations in low Earth orbit. That became the focus. And then they lied that they never actually were interested in it anyhow. Of course, many people in the United States and the security agencies knew that that was not true. But at any rate, that was the official position of the Soviet Union, that they weren't interested when in fact they'd spent a lot of money on it. Of course, their unmanned missions to the moon, some of those were quite successful. The Lunar Code missions and bringing back samples from the moon, those more scientific unmanned programs did have some success.
Might want to let Robert in.
Yes.
Hello there. Hello, everybody.
Howdy. In that case, so I'm going to suddenly interrupt our conversation. I am delighted to have our third panelist. We have been, so it started at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. We've just had daylight savings time. That may have made a difference coming in. I beg your pardon on that one. We've had our two talks already, Mr. David, on the broad background, the American background in particular, Professor Jenks more on the Russian background, in particular the implications of the Ukraine war for future the space programs elsewhere. May I ask you to do your speech, 12 to 14 minutes, your talk, informal, conversational in tone, and then we can pick up with more questions from the audience.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I've missed the daylight saving time then. It hasn't gone over here. So I checked last week and went by what I found then. I'm very sorry. Everybody has been having kittens. Okay. Can I please, can I share my screen with you? I've got just one or two pictures to show, which might illustrate things.
Yes, down at the bottom, there should be a share screen button.
Okay, yep. And that's what I'll share. Okay. Okay, can you see the whole presentation or can you just see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay, it fills the screen okay, does it? I can't see what you can see.
It's not filling the whole screen, but we can see the image well enough.
Right, okay, let's try that then. Is that better? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm sorry I missed what other people have said. But I mean, I guess I'm here because of my perspective on the view of Earth from space being the most important thing, in my view, ultimately, about what happens with the space race. Because when you go out into space, when you start from the Earth, your perspective is very much looking up into space and looking onwards and outwards, as you can see from this sort of 1970s, I think, NASA booklet, spacefaring people. But when you go out into space, for astronauts who did go right out way past Earth orbit, the most important thing in space was the Earth. But coming round to that from a slightly longer way round, the Cold War context of the space race is very well known. It was very politically anchored. After the shock of Sputnik and the first attempts the Russians actually got the first couple of probes to reach the moon as well. Kennedy was committed to closing the missile gap and rolling back Soviet influence. He was knocked back further by the Gagarin flight and by the Bay of Pigs failure. And that prompted the announcement that we will go to the moon. We'll do this difficult thing before the decade is out. It's an important bit of political showboating. It wasn't the only thing, even the most important thing about the space race, but it was the thing that kicked it all off. And Kennedy had picked this because it looked like something where the United States, which appeared to be behind in space, could overhaul the Russians by the end of the decade. And the Russian lead in space, the apparent lead in space feats with the first soft lunar landing, Venus landing, woman in space, spacewalk, carried on until the mid-1960s. The Russians did get a huge political benefit from this apparent lead. But if you look at why Kennedy picked space travel, I mean, what is it about space? It might seem an obvious question that makes space seem the future. Why is a submarine just a submarine, but a rocket is the future? And that, I think, really relies a great deal on the decades, particularly the previous 10, 15 years of thought about space as being an inevitable part of the human future. We all knew it was going to happen. It was the dominant vision of the future. And so by going into space, it almost appeared like you were leading the way into the future. Howard McCurdy a while ago did a wonderful book called Space and the American Imagination, showing how Disney, Collier's magazine, Wernher von Braun, science fiction films, a lot of the culture and stuff about space travel, culturally prepared the way for Kennedy to be able to pick space travel as the thing that America could demonstrate it was leading the way into the future, very important at the time. And Kennedy used the phrase, this new ocean, space travel was going to be the new Atlantic Ocean, and the exploration of space was compared to the Renaissance age of exploration. And we have it illustrated here, a ship that might be the Mayflower and the different means of transport, the plane, the jet plane, and then afterwards, the implication is the space rocket. There's a continual a single line of technological progress that we can track and predict and get ahead of. And there was much talk as well about the space frontier, which actually, quite interestingly, Wernher von Braun very much had the language of technology and progress. And I think the German idea of Lebensraum, of room to expand into, mapped, quite conveniently onto the idea of American Western expansion as well. And so going into space was presented as the next natural feature of this long-term progress. It made it seem historically grounded as well. And this is from a piece of space art by Ron Miller in 1991, but it carries on the story of this entire fleet of things leading the way into space. I mean, the idea of this being a kind of inevitable technological evolution into space is a misuse of the word evolution. It's a much misused term. The interesting thing about space is that the pioneers, the science fiction pioneers, tended to imagine that space travel would be done by pioneering types, by free people, by independent spirits, by pioneers. The idea of some kind of high-tech homesteading in space, brave souls going out, much as the Renaissance explorers and so forth had done. But the reality was that the space program, as it happened, the manned space program and the space race, as it happened in the 1960s, was very much a matter of big government, NASA, a huge government organization, supported by taxes, needing huge public and political support, not the crazy ideas of a few far-sighted pioneers. It was an absolutely massive operation. And it was seen by the visionaries as a kind of way of escaping from government and regulation. And yet the secret of NASA, as the first administrator, James Webb, or the first long-term administrator, James Webb, said, was really space age management. And an important part of what made NASA successful was not just management, but the fact that it spread a huge amount of high-tech industry all over the southern United States, creating a kind of, if you like, a kind of second Reconstruction, bringing an end to the Jim Crow age. So it was of political importance there. Also, the pioneers had imagined that there would be a sustained space program that once it took off would be able to keep going. The great imagining thing was the big rotating space station that would act as a permanent platform onto the moon and then the other planets and so forth. And also Arthur Clarke and other pioneers imagined that we're going to be nuclear rockets that would actually reach the moon and the planets so that it could be sustained as well. But in fact, what we got was a very fairly old-fashioned space program, enormously high-tech and impressive, but compared with the nuclear mode, a kind of relatively quick and dirty way of getting very heavy rockets very fast to relatively short distance without the space station and the infrastructure that would keep it going. So there was a kind of dash into space. And so what should have been a sort of permanently sustained natural technological development actually became a government-supported dash. The NASA administrators used a lot of this rhetoric about space. I'm not at all sure they believed this. I was looking through the papers of Thomas Paine, the successor to James Webb in 1968 as NASA administrator, and he's giving instructions to a colleague who's got to stand in for him, giving a speech to the Office of Naval Research. And he says, okay, well, tell him about this, tell him about that. And then I have it in his own hand, blah, 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 about the challenge of space. Finale. And I'm reading from this here with apologies. He says, why not end on an upbeat note, talk about sea power, exploration, renaissance. And so today, the spacefaring nations are acquiring a new cosmic view, a new and better understanding of man's position in the universe as the challenge of space inspires us to blah, blah, blah. So this is very much presented as an important rhetoric, but it was not what was necessarily driving the space program. Thomas Paine also said, and this is where we get on to the my final point about the environment. In December 1968, just before Apollo 8 went up, and of course they were the first astronauts to leave Earth orbit and go around the moon, Paine also said, quite far-sightedly, an important new viewpoint of this century has been our developing recognition that Earth is not an unlimited planet. Our ecosystem is bounded rather than an infinite ecosystem. And of course, this was then what the famous Apollo 8 Earthrise picture and the other pictures of the Earth revealed. This is the picture taken by the astronauts from the moon, showing Earth rising above it. Now, if you go by the high-tech vision of space exploration, the sight of the Earth from a distant planet, even the moon, should have been the sight of leaving home, of saying bye-bye to the Earth, of getting the Earth in its cosmic perspective, of seeing it how small, how unimportant it was. And as the Russian thinker Tsiolkovsky said, you know, the Earth is our cradle, but you've got to leave the cradle sometime. It should have been a vision of bye-bye, of progress, of leaving home. But the astronauts who saw it said it was a heart-wrenching thing. It made them homesick. And Bill Anders, famously, who took or may have taken this photo, said, you know, there we were out in space, and yet the most important thing was the Earth. It was fragile, it was beautiful. You know, he doesn't say it meant the world to us, but that was the import. This and other Earth images then gave the early environmental movement, which is already underway, a picture to think with. It gave them a picture of the Earth as a limited ecosystem with billions of miles of uninhabited vacuum beyond, something that was completely self-sustaining. The only thing really changing was the energy going in and out from the sun. And this was very much in line with understandings that were being got from the earth sciences as well. The environmental sciences were actually part of the origin of the manned space program. Sputnik, Russia's first satellite, was presented as a Russian contribution to the whole business of Earth monitoring, to the stages of monitoring the Earth from space, because the International Geophysical Year of 57 to 8, this 18-month international program, was there to monitor the Earth, to measure the Earth, to check the Earth's atmosphere, in a way to get an all-round scientific view of the Earth as far as possible, to see almost how it functioned as a whole planet. And this actually brought us the CO2 monitoring on Hawaii and the baseline readings that have gone up so alarmingly ever since. And at the same time, the partial test ban treaty, in the aftermath of the Cuba crisis of '62, the partial test ban treaty came in 1963. It banned nuclear explosions and weapons in space. And together with the treaty of the Space Rescue Treaty and the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, it effectively internationalized space. It was no longer going to be a zone of military competition, as Wernher von Braun and others had predicted in helping to make a case for space travel and large rockets to start with. But space was going to be internationalized like the high seas. It was going to belong to everybody. People had to be rescued. You could use it, but nobody would own it, hence the astronauts going to the moon for all mankind. And this was modeled on the treaties of the high seas and also the various treaties that had govern the Antarctic as an international wilderness to be used for scientific purposes. And then finally, right at the end of the Apollo program, the very last Apollo flight, Apollo 17, December 1972, leaving the Earth, because of the time it launched, this amazing fully lit view of the whole Earth, the blue marble picture. And although we've had other pictures of the whole Earth, this in a way still stands for it. The Earth is fragile. The atmosphere is as thin relatively as the skin on an apple peel. And this view from Earth created a great understanding, an even deeper understanding of how fragile the Earth was and how it was a kind of self-contained ecosystem, if you like. It gave James Lovelock his Gaia hypothesis. The view from space also contributed scientifically, I think, to an understanding of the way that Earth worked. Because Lovelock's insight, and he said it was partly inspired by seeing these early Apollo pictures of the Earth, was that the Earth's atmosphere wasn't just given for life to flourish in. The Earth's atmosphere was itself a complex atmosphere, unique on all the planets of the solar system, and it was complex because it was formed by the action of life. That was why there was so much oxygen. If it wasn't for life continually sustaining this mixed complex balance of the Earth atmosphere, it would become very, very simplified, and the atmospheres of Mars and Venus were much more monotonous. They were not complex and life-bearing at all. And then he had a conversation with Carl Sagan, and Carl Sagan said to him that over some very long lifetime, they reckon that during the lifetime of the Earth, life on Earth and more, the output of energy from the sun had gone up by about 30%. But as far as they could tell, the average temperature of the Earth had remained pretty much stable. And this gave Lovelock his insight that, in fact, the Earth, life on Earth, was helping Earth regulate its temperature, was helping regulate and sustain the conditions for life on Earth. And nowadays, that was, I mean, in Lovelock's day, Gaia was seen as a bit of a left field hypothesis because of the semi-spiritual way he phrased it. But now Earth system science is utterly mainstream. The International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is probably the biggest and most successful program in the history of science, and has given us phenomenal amounts of knowledge about the Earth and about how it works, and has shown how much damage humans are doing by basically digging up several 100 million years worth of carbon and chuck it in the atmosphere in the space of a few generations. Of course, it'll make a difference. So I would argue that not just the view of Earth from space was the most important thing that came from the space program, but actually all the Earth system sciences that went with being able to get out of the Earth and look in and measure things created a scientific understanding of the way that the Earth worked. So in a way, the IPCC and our current understanding and possible survival now also dates back to the space program. And there, I'll leave it.
Thank you so much. I'm going to encourage people who are listening to, if you have particular questions about anything Dr. Poole has been saying, please do it. If there are actually questions from our other panelists, which you immediately want, please do that. Otherwise, I will go to some other questions here on the Q&A or chat buttons.
I guess I'd like to ask Robert what, your great presentation there brought to mind one of the factors that you've seen over and over again with any astronauts you talk to, and that's the overview effect, coined by Frank White. I mean, and it was very interesting to listen to our Star Trek captain go up on a suborbital flight and Bill Shatner and look at space as death while looking down at the Earth as life. So it kind of gets to your point about how space activities now have, and I think Richard Branson has always been a big proponent of people getting up off the Earth to look down at it, to have a broader perspective of the fragility and take more ownership and stewardship of caring for the planet. So those are all positive things about space to me as well.
Yes, very positive things, and I think surprising, unexpected things that weren't planned for. Yeah, the overview effect, there's been a lot of debate about that. There's absolutely no, I mean, wouldn't all of us love to go up and see the Earth from a height, to see this wonderful thing for ourselves? I think there is, though, quite an important distinction to be drawn between seeing the Earth from orbit, this beautiful planet that we first saw properly from the Gemini missions, particularly the spacewalks, gave us those amazing photographs in 65, 66. And seeing the Earth from a great distance. I mean, anybody who's seen the Earth, try to look at the moon from an aeroplane window, we know it's actually quite hard to find the moon. You know, it's much harder to see the Earth from a very little small rotating spaceship window that might be fogged up when you're really, really busy. So those small moments when the astronauts, often just a few minutes, had to look at the Earth, had a really deep effect on them. And seeing the Earth as very small from a huge distance, I think, is a stage again from the overview effect. So I would say that I think Frank White, although his book is, you know, very impressive and captures a lot that's important, I think a distinction between, if you like, the overview effect and the whole Earth, the deep space effect of seeing the Earth as a tiny planet, I think that's a stage beyond. And maybe we're going to get some views like that. We've got very used to views of the Earth and pictures of the Earth, but I think when astronauts get out there and see the blue marble, it may feel different again.
So I have a wicked question to ask. So you've been talking about the environmentalist effects of the space program. Let me put it to you that the biggest effect of the space program was that it, one, enabled satellite technology, two, allowed for the total pervasiveness of social media, three, made it that people stop looking up and out, but only look inwards at their phones, and therefore four, as somebody else has mentioned, has killed off any desire for a future space program. Thoughts, comments, pushback?
Well, agreement initially, yes, because all those things have happened, but they are an important part of the space program, as indeed were the black projects, you know, the military projects, which helped to sustain NASA in a way that wasn't obvious as well. Yeah, but you don't need a manned space program to do all that. Again, the early pioneers, imagine Arthur Clarke, you know, the man who supposedly came up with the concept of the geostationary satellite. He imagined until quite late on there would actually be an orbiting space station that would be manned, and that would be a continuous, like a monitoring outpost in the desert, something like that. You didn't need a manned space program to do all that. But yeah, I think that in a way that also underlines my point about the whole Earth effect, the deep space version of the overview effect. Earth orbit has now become part of the Earth. We thought of it as space when we were looking up to it, but now we are very used to treating Earth orbit as pretty much an orbital motorway for planet Earth. And, you know, if you want to get out into the countryside, it's the moon and beyond. So I think the boundaries, if you like, of what we think of as the Earth have expanded to include that view from orbit and to include all the telecommunications. And of course, ironically, in the space age, we have lost the dark skies. Only a few % of the Earth's population ever see the dark skies, ever actually see space in the theatre. With the space age has blotted out space, at least from the Earth. But like all of you, I mean, the future James Webb Space Telescope, the Mars missions, what can be done with unmanned missions, I find that as absolutely exciting as anybody. So the unmanned stuff can also take us way beyond the Earth.
Any other responses to my wicked question, or shall I go on to another question?
I guess there's a couple things that are fragments of thoughts, and maybe they'll make sense when I say them, but my mother is gone now, but I remember her telling me the meek shall inherit the earth, but the brave ones are going to the moon. And that always stuck with me, and it's probably why I'm still enamored with not only robotic, but human exploration. There's something about the context of the times hasn't been brought up. And I think maybe Andrew can talk about that one, but you know, we do tend to forget all the ancillary things that are going on at any one given time, and somehow the space program fits into that, and sometimes it doesn't. And there's still a cadre of space travelers ready to go. They're wiping the visor on their helmet. They're ready to go. And so it's not like it's a universal thing that the space exploration agenda with humans is a given, but I think it's a given to a certain, I don't want to say caliber, but a certain type of person that has adventure in their heart. And that's hard to pin down. That's hard to pin down. And so I think in listening to Robert's thing, it seems to me like there is a space program, and we've inherited incrementalism. It's a piecemeal activity, depending on the times, and it may not be the 21st century. We'll have boots all over Mars or whatever, but I think the fuse has been lit on this one, and I just think there's a part of human nature that is exploring other places in person, and maybe virtual reality will become a new type of exploration theme. But so I'm kind of resolute that humans are going to do human things, and they're going to explore, and this planet is finite in resources, and there's other activities that people are putting together, whether it's space mining. Something's happening when the lawyers are engaged. There are so many space lawyers I get notes from about the Artemis Accords and working together, or are we working separately, and the peaceful uses of space, or the useful pieces of space. I get it all. So it's alive and well, but I guess I circle back on the context of the times. If we're in a World War III situation, I don't know where we're going to be.
I'd be interested to know what Andrews thinks about that.
Yeah, I like that. I like this idea of the context of the times. Of course, being an historian, I suppose, so that we need to think about the historical context that produced what's called the space race. And it was a really unique time, right, where people's gazes and attention were focused on these very large space programs, and thinking of this competition between two ideological opponents. And that context is, irreproducible. You can't reproduce it. And I think that, it's going to continue. It's going to be, but it's going to be much different, right? And I think that, to get back to the original question, the enthusiasm, the passion, the romanticism has been focused into virtual space, right? Colonization of virtual space, and by national security agencies of various sorts, but also by dreamers and romantics. That seems to be where at least my kids' attention is focused. They're going to inherit, all of this. I'm not sure that they're looking upwards so much. And also, as pointed out, you look upwards these days, and it's pretty hard to see much of anything with all the ambient light and so forth. But I hope that's not too pessimistic.
Well, let me propose an optimistic thing, that the Golden Age science fiction view wasn't wrong, merely premature, that we had to have 60 years of NASA, and now you get on to Elon Musk, who is, as everybody knows, Iron Man, and really a science fiction comic book superhero. But we are, in point of fact, starting, the private sphere exploration of space. Pretty soon, we'll have wagons to the stars, etc. Anybody want to go out on a limb and say we're actually getting back to the Golden Age, just in the 2020s rather than the 1960s?
I would say the opposite. The pioneering spirit and the spirit of adventure are fine things, but you need a lot of high-tech equipment. That'll take you to the deep down in the oceans. It'll take you across the Antarctic, with one sledge. It'll take you up to the top of Everest without any extra oxygen and so forth. But you need a vast high-tech program and a completely different skill set. to expand into space. And when you get one little way into space, you still barely got past the Earth. I don't think the idea of human colonization, even of the planets, I think is a 20th century fantasy that we should leave behind. I think I'm impressed by the unmanned exploration, the automatic probes, the Webb telescope, the Mars things, which also Leonard knows so much about and is so inspired. I think these things are absolutely fantastic. And I think in the digital, the high tech, the remote control age, we need to get away from 20th century fantasies and 50s syndrome about everything getting bigger and bigger and more energy hungry and bolder and braver and so forth. That's kids stuff. The future is with the technology, and the human spirit, I think, goes through the technology.
Pushback, alternate opinions.
Well, I just think there's a, I think we're in a renaissance of thinking about space in different terms. I agree with that.
Yeah.
That's clear. And the robotic exploration, it is unbelievable what you can even think about anymore. Winged vehicles on Titan. We got a helicopter that just flew for the 21st time on Mars. It's also that Perseverance rover sucked in oxygen and transformed it, or carbon dioxide, and made oxygen out of it. And so, I think, rebooting the moon, I think is going to be very interesting. I think, again, the dynamic of China also wanting to set up a lunar base themselves is going to poke us in the United States in the eye a bit. And so I don't see, a diminishing of interest in putting people in places that are destination dangerous, but I think the foreign other countries may drive us to either take part or think it's a space race or collaborate in some manner. I don't see that going away. So I think humans doing human things on other worlds is still okay, it's TBD. But pick a destination. It could be the moon, it could be Mars, it could be again, I think technology is going to allow us to cut the solar system travel time considerably. And when you look at even spacesuits, where are we going to put people in these suits on other worlds? I mean, when you look at the fashion statement of people going to mountain peaks on Earth, across desert, underneath the ocean, walking across polar expanses, it shows you that people have a driving interest in exploration. And some of that is just new technology. And we've seen it evolve over decades and decades, where humans can now visit almost every scary part of the planet and learn new things. So I think you're onto something there, Robert, but I don't think there are people that are not going to hear your message. I think they're going to go.
I want to interrupt with a related question. How much has the space program been captured or channeled by the dreams and the administrative paths of the past? How much does it respond to new technology, new events? That is to say, if NASA made an administrative decision in 1965, is it still governing how the American space program works in 2022, or to what extent does it? And if we do, say, a space elevator in 2040 to near Earth orbit, will that in point of fact be following the idle engineering schematics worked out in, say, 1970 or 1980?
I don't think we've got the carbon budget for space elevators. I think the space program doesn't matter. What matters is the Earth program. if we can follow the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and restore humanity to some sort of sane balance with the Earth, which is the only thing that we have to support us in the long term, then I'm happy to, to admit that give us 100, 150 years, it may be possible to find low energy, low impact, really smart ways of exploring space. But we haven't got the carbon budget for it at the moment. Maybe we could work on building that carbon budget. But I think what the space program has shown us is that the Earth is limited. And I don't think we've properly taken that on board. I go back to my point before, that what the study of the Earth from space, the whole Earth perspective from space, the technology monitoring from space partly has given us, is an understanding that we are a species which in the space of a few generations of its own species, that's not very long, we have overwhelmed our planet. We have changed the composition of its atmosphere. The conditions of life and basic existence are moving very rapidly against us, and we have to use all our ingenuity and all our resources merely to slow down and stop before we can even reverse the effect that this is having on us. If we can do that, then we may have a future in space. But the future in space depends upon the future on Earth, and I think that at the moment is decidedly in the balance.
I would just, that's Robert, that's so well put. It's hard to argue with that. The other thing that I thought of has to do with kind of the elephant in the room here, and that is all the Black programs and classified programs and on all sides, right? And that's sort of, how do we evaluate their role in all of this? And of course, it's difficult because they're secret. Some people are privy to those secrets, but most of them are sworn to secrecy. So I think that that's kind of like a wild card here. Some of the things that are going on in those Black programs, not only in the United States, of course, but many other places. And I suspect, that mostly they're oriented toward military applications and spying.
Yeah, I'd say one of the worrisome things that I try to write about and keep an eye on, but you're correct, and a lot of it's classified, but a lot of it's out in the open, and that is the military march to cislunar space and to the moon. So we're seeing before us in the last decade, and with the inauguration of the U.S. Space Force, it's becoming another regime of military operations, not only by the U.S. but other countries as well, as you point out. That to me is a troublesome sign, because look where we are today, given air, land, sea warfare. And so let's just extend it into space and do beyond LEO, MEO, and GEO. And now you see the kind of a Air Force Research Lab is lunar snooper satellites out there. So it's another part of the piece of the puzzle that's puzzling, given our situation here on Earth and our ability to destroy us all. And so let's march it into space to a greater degree. That's what's happening now. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, if you go by the, I'm curious, Leonard, that I share your concerns about this kind of thing. I think it's a misuse of space, and it's tragic, and I wouldn't want to see it continue. But surely, if we compare the relative scale of these things, the amount of resources going into them, the geopolitical importance of these things, that these are, we can talk about the human impulse and the impulse of exploration into space, but that's pretty small beer, isn't it, compared with, objectively the way that space exploration and use of space is developing now.
I guess, I'm just flagging the fact that you're seeing a very concerted and directed effort we're beyond weaponizing space. I mean, there are weapons in space already. Yeah. And here we are, and you talk about Earth environment. look at the space environment and how a dump truck operation this has become in low Earth orbit. And the reason you can't sometimes see the sky is, astronomers are, clacking quite a bit now about constellations of mega, satellites, Starlink and OneWeb, and other countries want to pursue even thousands more satellites. And, at some point, I mean, even launches today, they have to take into account launching in a certain time frame, not to run into anything on the way up. So, you've got an environmental embarrassment as we have here on Earth, but in space. And I'm fragmenting here, but I would love to hear your view of how we fouled the Earth up and whether or not this gives credence to planetary terraforming. That getting our ability to get the Earth under control, is that going to give us some kind of ability of taking that kind of toolkit to another planet and change the environment of Mars? Some people suggest that's what's happening.
I'd leave Mars alone. Actually, I think we need to clear up the Earth first. Let me move on. I've given you one positive, which I think is an absolutely huge positive of space travel, which is the view of the Earth and the rapid development of the environmental sciences. Let me give you another one, peace.
Oh.
Because in the early 60s, we came that close to nuclear war. And the space program was very closely involved with military projects. The missiles were closely related to military missiles. The army, the navy were sending up missiles and so forth. They were completely inseparable. And a lot of the early case for the space race, as I mentioned before, came from the fear that the Russians would get into space first and station weapons there or even on the moon. Now, none of that actually happened. What we got was the huge scare of the Cuban Missile Crisis and then rapidly running the other way, internationalizing space. And so when I grew up looking at space, I didn't see a potential theater of war. I didn't see something terribly threatening. I saw a peaceful zone. I didn't know much about the nuclear arms race. I think psychologically that the race into space was, in many ways, it implied that there was a positive alternative to this race to nuclear destruction that was so preoccupying people in the late 50s, early 60s, because by implication, if we were going into space, we were going into this quiet, peaceful international space. We were going somewhere where cooperation was necessary, where progress was necessary, where you couldn't safely make war. This, if you like, was the non-nuclear future. There was a lot of talk in the late 40s, early 50s about a kind of atomic crossroads. If we, mankind could blow itself up, but if we didn't blow ourselves up, what would the future be like? And I kind of think psychologically, in going in the route into space, we were going on that route away from the atomic crossroads, the peaceful route that took you away from nuclear war. And of course, a lot of these programs, we say black programs, as if they were, the Dark Star or something in Star Wars. A lot of them were about defense. A lot of them were about surveillance. A lot of them were about detection and prevention and balance and intelligence and monitoring information, calming down, and so on. I think my younger self, who protested a lot about weapons, wouldn't have seen it like that. But I'm increasingly wondering about how far the space race was a kind of diversion of resources in a peaceful direction.
I think that if I might just add to that, the subject of what I've been looking at for a number of years, the Apollo-Soyuz test project, I think is a manifestation of that. And that what was it a test of? It was a test of an escape hatch should there be an incident with the crew in orbit, so that you could hook up ideological opponents, Soviet Union, United States, to each other, their Soyuz and Apollo capsules, and both sides could survive. And that sort of had implications that went beyond the mere act of surviving in space to surviving on Earth. And it was explicitly designed by both sides as a way to reset the relationship so that both sides wouldn't blow each other up. And I think it actually at some level worked. And it set the stage for seeing space as an arena for cooperative, peaceful collaboration, leading all the way on up to the International Space Station. Despite what's going on in Ukraine, an American on March 30th will be taken back to Kazakhstan by the Russians, and the Russians have promised that they're not going to leave him on the International Space Station. They're going to give him a ride back. So that there is a space is the one place where Russians and Americans can get along now. The only place, actually.
Although conversely, the Europe-Russian Mars program, I hear, is on the back burner at the least.
Yeah.
Which kind of it makes the same point in a reverse way. War is bad for space.
I am going to interrupt at this moment. It is 3:30. And this is when we turn into pumpkins and the carriage goes home and all that. May I ask if each of you could perhaps have a closing statement briefly, and then I would just sort of wrap up for the National Association of Scholars. Perhaps in reverse order alphabetically. Dr. Poole, Dr. Jenks, and then Mr. David.
Closing statement, yeah. I think what I would say is that looking at it historically more and more, the circumstances that gave us the version of going into space that we had in the 1960s, the manned space race, the Cold War, Russia against America. We've argued about its consequences and so forth. It's not repeatable. It's not going to be repeated. It wasn't what the prophets of space, what the visionaries, what the pioneers expected. It's what happened, but I don't think anything like it will ever happen again. And so when you say that, okay, maybe, it's the pioneers, the Bransons, the Musks, the Bezoses and so forth. Well, I don't know about that. But, at any rate, the future space program is already looking hugely different. So I think in historical perspective, we're not going to get the 60s again, and a good many people would say. And I still like to think, I'd like to be optimistic about space. I think the robotic exploration of space and the revelations that it gives us about, to be honest, the lack of life, the lack of sustainability of existence outside Earth, I think will focus minds on understanding how desperately important it is to concentrate on the Earth. And I think that the huge boost, in many ways unexpected, unplanned, but also actually bound up with manned spaceflight in hidden ways, the huge boost that space programs of that period gave to the environmental sciences just at the time when we were becoming environmentally aware, I think is also a big long-term benefit of space travel. So I'd like to end on a slightly alternative optimistic note.
Thank you. Dr. Jenks.
Yes. Wow, that's I'm trying to think of something new to say, but I think that I don't have an awful lot of optimism for the future of the Russian space program as a major participant, and because I think that of the corruption and the lack of attention to keeping good engineering talent and good scientific talent, and now the disaster of the invasion of Ukraine and what it says about Russian investments in military and investments more generally. So I think that I'm going to echo what Leonard said. I think we need to look at China. China just seems to be doing an awful lot of interesting stuff that may, get the competitive juices flowing again in the United States.
Thank you. Mr. David?
Yeah, it's really enjoyed all of this. It was very interesting. Like I warned you up front, as a writer and journalist, I don't have much time to think for myself. I'm quoting other people all the time. So it's hard to aggregate, kind of closing thought, other than I'm optimistic. I think there are some very encouraging exploration signs. Certainly the search for life in the universe. I think we probably already discovered life on Mars through Viking and some other things, but I think we got some surprises coming. And anything that I think about over the last decades of reporting, it's packed with surprises and failure and human loss of life, and the James Webb Space Telescope is going to be a pioneering instrument if it all works out. I think our place in the cosmos is going to have a different feel to it, thanks to that, and also ground-based astronomy. But I do think that the Chinese card is going to be big, and we're not paying enough attention. I think that will draw more attention to our own space agenda, government space agenda. Meanwhile, the commercial space entrepreneurs, there's probably been 5 or 6 that started since we began this talk. They're out there. There's a lot of young, creative talent, and nobody's going to forget the Earth. I'm not, paranoid about, we're going to lose the planet. But I do think, I agree with Robert. We got to pay more attention to our own launch pad here before we ascend to a new greatness in space exploration. Thanks.
David, are you there? All right. Well, it appears that David's disappeared, but I will say goodbye to all of y'all. Thank you guys again for that wonderful conversation. It was very, very enjoyable. All right. Thank you guys. Bye now.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it very much.
Right.
Nice seeing you all virtually,
Okay.
but
Yes,
wish it was
good-
in person.
Yeah, good to see you again, Andrew.
Yes,
Albeit
many
virtually.
years since Berlin.
Yeah, yeah. I would like, can I apologize properly now for getting the time mixed up? I've got my computer set to what I believed and checked this afternoon was